Over on my homepage here, I can see I have a list of chats with all my contacts, and I can also see that there is a count of how many unread messages I have within each chat. If I was to then select to open up that chat, I can see that all of my own messages are displayed on the right-hand side of my page, and all of the other contacts' messages are displayed on the left. Then if I was to send a new message, it would add that entry into our chat and continually display it on the right-hand side of our page. Hello, my name is Lachlan Kirkwood, and today I'll be teaching you how to build a messaging application like WhatsApp entirely out of no-code using Bubble. If you're not familiar with Bubble, it's by far one of my favorite no-code tools, as it allows you to build completely custom applications without writing a single line of code. I love that it gives you complete control over your own custom database, the design to create your own interface, the workflows to stitch your application together, and also the ability to integrate with third-party tools and services. For those of you who don't know me, I'd spent the past year working with the Bubble team to write their How to Build blog series. This series took a list of the top products out there on the market, like Airbnb, Uber, and Instagram, and explained the step-by-step process to rebuilding these with Bubble's tool. While this series helped thousands of no-coders across the world build their application, I wanted to create my own video series and explain each of the steps in more specific details. Of course, I would just like to note that this series has no affiliation with Bubble at all, and it's something that I'm doing within my own time. Within today's tutorial though, I'm going to be walking you through the process of creating a WhatsApp clone. This will include features like registering user accounts, creating new contacts and chats within our application, displaying a list of user chats on a homepage screen, allowing users to send and receive messages within our application, followed by a feature that will display notifications for any unread messages within a chat, and then finally a feature that will allow us to create a navigation menu between each page in our application. There's plenty I want to cover throughout this build, so grab your Bubble editor and let's get started. The first feature I wanted to cover within our tutorial today isn't actually a core feature that users will interact with throughout our WhatsApp application. Instead, I just wanted to take the time to run us through the process of setting up and configuring our own custom database in Bubble, which of course will be used to power the rest of our application. Now, throughout this tutorial today, I'm going to be keeping a list of everything that I'm working on within a Notion doc here, and I'll be sure to make a link to this template accessible. But within this doc, I like to just keep a list of all of the different data types and fields I'll need to add, as well as all of the features I'd like to cover. And what I love about Notion is that it just allows me to keep an active checklist of everything that I'm working on. And I can of course check these items off as I've finished adding them into my Bubble application. It just helps me keep a good track of where I am throughout my build. One thing I would just like to note though is that at any point throughout this tutorial today, if you find yourself getting lost or if you're a little confused at times, I'd strongly recommend that you pause the tutorial and re-watch any steps before moving forward, as it's always detrimental to try and understand the content that I'm trying to walk us through. So before we jump into Bubble to create the custom database, I just wanted to give you an overview of the data types and fields that I have here. This database, in comparison to some of my other builds, is actually quite small and straightforward to build. In this case, there's only 3 different data types. There's the user, so people who are registering accounts. There is a chat, and then within that chat, we're going to have messages that are sent and associated with the chat between 2 users. And now, of course, I'll be walking us through all of the necessary data fields within each data type as I add them into my database. So if we open up Bubble and head to our data tab here on the left-hand side, the first thing you'll notice is that by default, Bubble actually has a user data type pre-registered for you. You won't need to create this separately. And by default, this data type will have an email and password field registered within it. So you won't need to create a data field to store those values. One thing I did just want to point out though is that you will also notice that Bubble has also added a set of privacy rules by default to the user data type. And if we were to click on those, it'll open up our privacy tab and just explain the rules that it has created. And so what this essentially means is that users who create anything within our database will only be allowed to see the content that they have created, not the content that others have created. And because we're creating an external facing messaging application, we obviously want users to create and send messages to each other that they can view. So in this case, I won't want this privacy rule to be applied to my user data type. So I'm going to delete this from our database. And you'll need to make sure that you follow this process as well, because if you don't manage this privacy setting, what you'll find is when you preview the application, you'll quickly see that content created from accounts that you aren't logged into won't actually display for you. And then it's quickly to jump to a conclusion and just assume the bubble is broken or there's a bug within your editor, whereas that's not the case. What you need to do is just properly manage this privacy rule here. And once we've managed the privacy rule, there is one last thing I'd like to show you, and that is that you'll need to uncheck this box here to add privacy rules to any additional data types you create within your database. Because if this box is checked, what you'll find is that you'll have the similar privacy rule attached to any other data type, meaning that not all users will be able to see the content that has been sent to them. But from here, what we can do is start to build out the data types and fields within our database. And of course, if you've had any experience building in Bubble before, you'll know that you'll need to add the different data types in first. So that way, when you're creating the data fields, you can easily reference any other data types to create a relational database. But again, I'll be explaining that in full detail as I walk us through this process. So if we jump into our Notion doc here, as I mentioned before, I have 3 different data types. There's the user, the chat, and the message. I'll need to add each of those into my editor here. So I'm going to add in the chat, and then finally I'll add in the message. And now from here, we can start adding in the data fields within our user data type. So if I jump into Notion, I'll just highlight all of the data fields we'll need to add in. So I'll start by adding in the name of the user. So whenever a user registers an account, I'd like to store a name within them that we can reference at any time. And this field type will just be a text field. It's pretty straightforward, so we'll just create that. I'd also like to register a phone number for a user, which is very similar to the real-world WhatsApp application. So I'm just going to type in the word phone number, and this field will actually be a text field type, not a number. And I'll be explaining why we're doing that later on throughout our build, but I'll just create that for now. And then for our users, I'd also like to store a profile photo. So this field type will just be an image. I will create that. And while we're here, I'd also like to register an about field about this user. So this could be something like a tagline or a bio. So this will just be a text field again. And then finally, I'll need to register a list of contacts that this user has. So these are the people that the user can message throughout our application. And so when I create this field, I'll be calling this contacts. And this field type will be a user. Only this time, I'm going to be selecting this option here to make this a list with multiple entries, which just means that a user who's logged in will have a list of contacts, which will be a list of other users. So I will choose to create that. And then I can jump into Notion and just check off that I've finished adding in all of the data fields for our user data type. Next, we can move down to our chat data type. And this again is a pretty straightforward data type to create. If I open up Bubble here, I'll select our chat data type. The first field I'd like to register is the users who are associated with this chat. So of course there'll be 2 users who can send messages to each other. So I'll be calling this field chat, users, and similar to before, this will be a user field type. And of course there's going to be more than one user in this chat, so this will need to be a list with multiple entries. I will create that. And then the last field I'll need to register for the chat data type is just a timestamp which allows us to recognize when a user has last opened the chat. And throughout our build today, we'll be using that to create chat notifications. So that way we can store a list of how many messages have been sent within a chat since a user has last viewed it. So I'm going to create a new field, and I'll be calling this last viewed by user. And this field type will be a date because I would like to create a date and timestamp for this field. So I'll choose to create that. And that's all we'll need to add into our chat data type. So we can jump back into Notion. We can check those off. And then finally, the last data type is just the message here. So I'm going to open up our database again, select the message data type, and the first field that I'd like to register is the chat that this message will belong to. So every time a message is created within our database, I'd like to store that with a particular chat between two users. So that way later on in our build, we can display a list of all of the messages that belong to every single unique chat. So I'm going to create a field here, and I'll be calling this chat. And then I would like this to link to the chat data type. And this is where you can start to see that we can create a truly relational database within Bubble, because now we're referencing the separate data type, which is also a chat. And I'll be explaining that once again in more detail when we get to the process of creating a message in our build. But for now, I'm just going to create this data field. And then finally, the last data field within our message is just the content of the message itself. So this is the text that someone will add to a message that's then sent to another user. So I'll be creating a separate field, and I'll be calling this message content. And this will just, of course, be a text field type. I'll create that. And that's all we'll actually need to create within our database. So if I jump back into Notion, I can check off the data fields for our message data type. As I mentioned before, this database is actually pretty straightforward in comparison to some of the other builds that I've created. Of course, if you would like to store any additional data, let's say within the user's account, I'd recommend pausing the tutorial now and taking the time to just add in any additional fields you might like. But for now, I'm happy with adding in just the 3 data types, and you'll start to see soon throughout our build how we'll be referencing these whenever we create a new feature. After we've finished configuring our database, we can move on to the list of features that I have laid out for us today. And you'll see that the first one isn't actually a core feature that users will need to send or receive messages, but instead it's just going to take the time to build out some of the underlying features we need to actually power our application. And the first one we'll need is the ability to register new user accounts within our platform. Thankfully, this is a fairly straightforward process, so let's jump over into our Bubble editor and I'll show you how we can get started. Over in my new editor here, I'm going to select to create a brand new page within this application. So I'm going to select from the page drop-down menu in the top left-hand corner here, and I'll be choosing to add a new page. I'll be calling this page register, and I'll choose to create that. And then the first thing I'll be doing on this page is just reducing the dimensions of it. So I'd like the width of this page to roughly resemble a mobile device. And then I could also just extend the height down a little bit as well. And like I do within all of my tutorials, I'd also just like to update the background color temporarily just to a light shade of gray, just so when I'm adding any input elements onto this page, I can see where they sit within the dimensions of the whole page itself. And now once I've finished adding in the page dimensions and the background color, I'm going to add in our first element. And in this case, it's just going to be a static text element at the top of our page. And I'll update the text displayed within this element to display the word create account. And then I'll also need to update the style of this to be a H2 style heading. I'm not too concerned about the actual overall design of our application today. Instead, I want to take the time to focus on the workflows you'll need to actually power your application. But if you would like to create your own custom styles, I'd recommend just pausing the tutorial here and adding in your own custom heading style. I'm just going to use the default H2 heading style here to save us some time throughout this build. But once I've finished selecting the style of this heading, I'm just going to reduce the width of this text element and then center this horizontally in our page. And then what I'd like to do is just copy this heading and then drag this down to the left-hand side of our page, because I'll also need to update the text within this heading to display the word name. And then below this, I'll be adding in an input field on the page where a user can add the details of their name that they'd like to register for this account. So I'll be heading over to our visual elements here and select from an input field. I'll drag this out across our page. And I'll be updating the name of this input field to be called input name. And the content format for this input field will just need to be the default text option, as we'll be storing a text value within it. The only thing I would like to do is just quickly edit the default style of this input field and just update the roundness of this to be 20. And you'll see that that just makes a small minor tweak on the input where it looks a little bit more clean. But that's one of the few design changes I'll be making throughout the build today. And once I've added the input field in, I can just move our static text heading across the page, just so it sits flush with the round border of our input. And then from here, what I'm going to do is copy both the heading and the input field. I might just quickly move that heading up 2 pixels, and then I'll just copy that. I'll drag this down. And in this instance, I'd like to now register the user's phone number. So I'll be updating the static text here to display the words phone number. And then I'll need to select the input field here, and I'll be updating the name of this to also be phone number. Now, although we're registering a phone number, I still want this content format to be a text field type, because that's how we have stored that within our database. And now that we've added in the phone number field, I'd like to copy both the heading and the input once again. I'll drag these down, and in this instance, I'll need to now register a user's email address. This is a requirement if you are creating user accounts within Bubble. So I'm going to update the static text here to display the word email, and I will update the name of this input field to also be email. And the one thing I'd like to note at this point is that we'll also need to update the content format to not just be a text format, but in this case it will need to be an email option. And what that will do is allow Bubble to verify that the email address they've added in is valid, and it won't allow a user to proceed throughout this page until they have added in a valid email address. And then finally, I'm going to need to add in one last field, and that's going to be the password of this user's account. So I'm going to copy both the heading and the input field again. I'll drag this down. I'll update the static text here to display the word password. And then for our input field, I'm going to update the name to be called password. And similar to before when we updated the content format, I'm going to select the next option, which will be the password content type. And what this will essentially do is just hide the characters that are displayed within this field. And that's all of the input forms I'm going to need to add onto this page. There's not a whole lot that I need to register immediately when a user creates an account. As I'll be showing you in a later module throughout our tutorial though, we can create a dedicated settings page that will allow a user to add additional information to their profile, like a bio or a profile photo, as well as update all of the existing data that they've added when they created an account. The last thing I would like to do to this page though is just scroll on up to our visual elements and add in a button element into the middle of the page here. And I'm going to update the text that this button displays to display the word register. And I am just going to quickly make a few minor tweaks to the style of this button. I'm going to choose to edit the style. I'll be pasting in a green color code, which is similar to the WhatsApp color. If you'd like that color code, it's 25D366. And then I'm also going to just update the roundness once again of this button to be 20, just so it has some curved borders. I'll then jump back into my design tab. I might just expand the width of this button, choose to center that horizontally, and just move that up a tad on our page. And now what I can do is create our first workflow within our build today. So when a user has finished adding in all of the details into our input fields, they'll select this button, and in that instance we'd like to run a workflow that registers their account within our database. So I'm going to select to create edit a workflow when our registration button is selected. And within this workflow, I'm going to select from the account option here, and I'll be choosing from the next first option beside this, which is the event to sign a user up. And what you'll see now is that Bubble will require an email and password to be registered when this account is created. So I'll need to match the data that's stored within our input fields on the page with the relevant fields within our workflow editor here. So I'll be selecting that the email field will need to be the same value as the input email field that we added on our page. And then I'll be doing the same for our password. So the password that we'll be storing in our database for this user's account is the same value that is in the input password field on our page. Now, what I also love about this step within the Bubble workflow is that you can change any other additional fields that you'd like to store for this user's account. So you can choose to change another field within your database for this user, and we can select from any other field that we have stored within our database for our user data type. So in this case, I'd like to register the name of the user, and this of course will be the same value as the input name field on our page. And then finally, I'd like to register the user's phone number. So I'll be selecting that the phone number in our database will need to equal the same value as the input phone number field on our registration page. And now before we jump ahead and preview what this experience looks like within our Bubble development environment, there's one last feature I'd like to add to this page. So as I'd mentioned, we'd only currently registered 4 fields within our user's account right now. And to allow a user to add any additional information to their profile, what I'd like to do is create a dedicated settings page within our application. And I'd like to actually send a user through to that settings page after they've registered an account, just to prompt them to update any additional fields within their account that they'd like to store. So I'm going to first of all start by creating a new page within our application. So I'll be heading to the drop-down menu in the top left-hand corner, and I'll choose to add a new page. And I'll just be calling this the settings page. I'll create this. And then at this point in our tutorial, I won't need to make any changes to this settings page right now. I'll be showing you how to do that later. But what I would like to do is just jump back over to our registration page, open up our workflow editor, select the workflow that we had just created where we were signing a user up. And what I'd like to do now is add an additional step in this workflow that now sends the user through to our settings page to allow them to update any other additional information they'd like to store within their account. So I'll be selecting from the navigation option here, and I'll choose the go to page event. And in this case, I'll just need to set the destination page to be the settings page within our application. And I won't need to actually send through any data at this point. There will be instances later on throughout our tutorial where we're opening up chats and messages where we will need to send data, but I'll be explaining that in as much detail as I can when we reach that point. For now though, I'm happy with how this process has been set up and configured. So let's jump over into our development environment and preview what this whole experience looks like. So over in my Bubble preview here, I have my registration page with all of the input fields that I just added. So I'm going to create a new account. I'll add in my name, Lachlan Kirkwood. I'll add in a random phone number. I'll also need to add in an email address. And you'll see that Bubble will verify that email address. And then finally, I'll need to add in a password. And once I've added in all of my details, I'm going to select the registration button here. That workflow will run. And now you can see we've been redirected through to the settings page within our application. Back in my Notion checklist here, I'm going to check off that we've finished creating our first feature of our build today, which was the ability to register user accounts. And throughout that experience, I not only explained how we could register a user's email and password, but also how we could register a user's phone number, which if you're familiar with WhatsApp, you'll know is a pretty detrimental feature that we'll be using later on. And then finally, I also explained how we could create a redirect through to a settings page once a user has registered an account. The next core component in our build is finally going to focus on a core feature that users will interact with when creating a new chat within our WhatsApp application. And throughout this process, I want to highlight how you can not only create a new chat between two users, but first of all, explain how users can also add contacts between each other's account on our platform. There's a little bit involved throughout this specific process, so be sure to watch as I walk you through in as much detail as possible. But I would just like to reiterate that if you find yourself getting lost at any point, take the time to pause the tutorial and rewatch any parts until they make sense. But from here, let's jump into our bubble editor and I'll start walking us through the process. Over in my bubble editor, I'm going to need to create a new page of our application. And this will actually be the home page where we're displaying a list of all the chats that a user is involved with. So I'm going to select from our page drop-down menu in the top left-hand corner of our editor, and I'll choose to create a new page. And this page will just be called Home. I'll create that. And the first thing I'll be doing on this page is, of course, just reducing the width of the page just to resemble a mobile device. I can also expand the height of it as well. And I'll also update the background color just to be a light shade of gray. So when I'm adding any white elements onto the page for now, I can just see where they lie in comparison to the page dimensions. I might also just expand the width out a tad there. And now the first thing I'll be doing is just adding a static text element into the center of our page at the top. And this will just display the word chats. I'll update this to be a H2 style heading. I will reduce the width of that element and then center that horizontally in our page. And as I mentioned, right now we're going to focus on building out a feature to create a chat before we then focus on displaying a list of all those chats on our homepage here that a user can click through to. So in order to start the process of creating a new chat, I'm going to add an icon onto the top right hand corner of my page here. And I'll be updating the icon to be a pencil icon. So if I just type in the word pen, you'll see here there is a pencil icon which just resembles the create button within WhatsApp. And then while I'm here, I'm also just going to remove the standard style for this icon, just so I can update the color with a blue color code, which is similar to the color code that's used within WhatsApp. If you'd like that code, it's 3741FA. And now when this icon is clicked, what I'd like to do is display a pop-up element on our page that would showcase a list of all of a user's contacts in which they can then choose to create a new chat with. And on that list, I'd like to display only those users who are contacts that don't currently have an existing chat with the current user who's logged in. And the reason I'd like to do that is because on our homepage here, I'm going to be displaying a list of all of those existing chats. So I don't want someone to be able to create two chats with the exact same person. I'd like to keep those centralized within one single chat. And I know that might sound confusing right now, but it'll make a lot more sense as I walk us through the process. So from here, what I'm going to do is just first of all move my icon over to the right hand side of our page. And then I'll be selecting from our containers menu here. And I'll choose to add a pop-up element onto our page. And if you're not familiar with pop-ups, they're just a great way to display any static or dynamic information without having to redirect a user through to a separate page. So this is currently being displayed over our home page, and if a user clicks away, it will simply just hide that pop-up. And at any point that we'd like to display that pop-up, we can reference it within a workflow, which we'll be doing later. So when this icon is clicked, it will display that pop-up. And now because pop-ups aren't displayed on the page by default, we'll need to scroll up to our Elements tree menu here. And when it's closed, we'll need to select the eye icon, which will then display this pop-up. And on this pop-up, I'll need to give it a name. I'm going to be calling this pop-up create chat. And similar to our homepage, the first thing I'll be doing is adding just a text element at the top, just so the user knows what exactly they can do on this pop-up. And this static text will just display the words create chat. I'll update the style of this to be a H2 style heading. I'll reduce the height and width of that element and center that horizontally in my pop-up. And now below this heading, what I'd like to do is display a list of all of the contacts that a user has stored in their profile. And as I mentioned, when they click on a particular user's name, it will create a chat with that person if one doesn't yet exist. But before we get to that point, we're going to need to also create a way to add a new contact to this user's profile. because at this point they don't have any registered contacts that they could get in touch with. And so in order to create an experience like that, I'm going to add an icon element onto my page. I will drag this out, and I'm going to search for the word plus, and I'm going to select this plus icon here. I'd like to once again also remove the style of this icon so I can paste in my custom color code, which is the same blue as the previous pencil icon. And then beside this, I'd like to just add some text that will trigger a workflow when it is clicked. So I'm going to copy our text heading here, drag this next to our plus icon, make it relatively centered in comparison to it as well. And then I'll update this to display the words new contact, and I'll need to expand the width of that element out. And from here, what we'll need to do is create a workflow when this text element is clicked. And I'll actually be referencing another pop-up element which will allow a user to search for a phone number and add that to their contact list. But just to help first of all illustrate the experience I'm going to create so it makes a bit more sense, I'm going to first just add a list of all of the users who are a contact of the person who's currently logged in. So I'm going to scroll on down to our repeating group element here, and I'll be adding this in. And if you're not familiar with repeating groups, they're a great way to display a list of dynamic data that you have stored within your database. So a user will have a list of contacts that they have stored within their account, and that is a list of users. So what a repeating group can allow us to do is actually display each single entry of every single user on that list. And a way a repeating group works is that it can reference the data you have stored within your database. You'll first just need to configure what particular data you'd like it to display. So I'm going to select the type of content I'd like to display within this repeating group to be a user. And then what I'd like to do is display the current user, their contacts, which if you remember in our database is saved as a list of users. So now all of those contacts will be displayed in every single row of our repeating group. I can then also update the layout style of our repeating group to be extended vertical scrolling, meaning it will extend or retract based on how many entries are stored within our database. And I'll update the number of rows for now to be 3. And now within our repeating group, what I can also do is choose to dynamically display any elements which can reference the list of users who are the current person's contacts. So I could display their profile photo and their name. And in order to do that, I'm going to start by adding in an image element into our first repeating group cell here. And what I love about repeating groups is that once you've added the dynamic element into the first row, it will automatically replicate that across every other row. And I'll show you what I mean. So I'll insert dynamic data here, and I'd like to display the current cell's user. So this particular contact, I'd like to display their profile photo. And you can see right now that it has replicated this data across every other row within our repeating group. What I'd also like to do while I'm here is just make sure this image is square. So I'm going to set the dimensions to be 50 by 50. And then I'd also like to update the roundness of this to be 100, so that way it is a perfect circle again. And then I can move that up into the top left-hand corner of our repeating group row. And now beside this, what I'd like to do is just add the name of this current user. So I'll add in a text element. I'll insert dynamic data. So I'll just be selecting the current cell's user, their name. And like any other text element, I can choose to open up our rich text editor. And if I'd like, I can highlight this text and choose to bold that. So now the name will be in bold formatting. I can then also just close off the height of that text element and move that in line with the center of my profile photo there. And then while I'm here, I'll also just move those across a tad so they're in line with my new contact button here. And I will just close off the remaining height at the bottom of our repeating group cell, just so there's not any empty space between each entry. And so if I was to backtrack to the icon and the new contact text that I've added, what I'd like to do from here is create a way to add a new contact when these elements are clicked. And then when that contact is added to this user's account, it will automatically display within this repeating group here, meaning that the current user would then have an option to create a chat with this person. And the way I'll be creating a new contact is by leveraging yet another pop-up element. So when this text is clicked, I'd like to close this existing pop-up that we're working on and then display another pop-up element which will contain a search field that we can just search for users by their registered phone number. So what I'm going to do right now is just close this current pop-up, and I would like to add another pop-up onto my page. This one's only going to be a relatively small pop-up in comparison to the previous one. And I'm going to name this pop-up New Contact. And like before, the first thing I'll be doing on this pop-up is just adding in a static text element just to give a point of reference to what the user will be doing on this element. And this text element will just display the word New Contact. I'll update this to be the default H2 heading style. Like before, I'm just going to reduce the height and width and center that within my pop-up here. And now from here, I'll be copying this heading. I'll drag this down. And I'll update this static text to display the word contact number, because below this I'll be adding in a search field where we can search for phone numbers. I would just like to update the styling of this text though from the H2 style to now be the body style. And I'll just open up our rich text editor and choose to bold that text. And from here I can just reduce the total height of it. I just don't want it to be too big in comparison to our main heading there. And as I mentioned below this, I'll be now adding in a search field that will allow a user to search for other users on our platform based on their registered phone number. So I'm going to scroll on down to our input fields, and instead of just selecting the regular input field, I'm going to choose to add in a search box. And the main difference between a regular input field and a search box is that a search box can dynamically pull and reference data stored within your database. So in this case today, I'm going to be searching through a list of all of the registered users on our platform based on their phone number that we have stored. So I'm going to be updating the name of this search box to be called search box user contact, and I will leave the choices style here to be a list of dynamic choices because, as I mentioned, I'll be searching dynamically through the data stored in our database. But what I'll need to do is define a list of options that I'll need to search for. So of course, as I mentioned, I'd like to search for all of the users in our platform. And once we've identified that we're searching for a list of users, I'll need to configure which particular field in our user data type we'll be searching for. And in this case today, it's going to be their phone number, meaning that whenever we type a phone number within this field, our application will recognize that value and match it with any other phone number that's currently stored within our database. And then of course we can reference the user at any time that that phone number belongs to. While I'm here though, I'm just going to quickly edit the style of this search box just so the roundness of its borders is 20, just meaning it'll have the curved edges once again. I can then just move that up, slightly across, maybe drag that out a tad and just move my heading above that so it's in line before the curved border. And that's the only input field we'll need to add onto this pop-up. What I will now need to do though is choose to add in a button element so we can actually save this new contact within the user's account. So I'll just drag a button element out here and I'll just choose to add the text save. I will then center that horizontally in my pop-up and just close off some of the empty space at the bottom of my pop-up. And now what I'll need to do is create a workflow when this save button is clicked that will save the contact who's currently stored in this field to not only the current user's list of contacts, but I'll also need to save the person who's logged in adding this user to the list of that user's contacts as well. So I'm going to start edit a workflow when the save button is clicked. And what I'd like to do is choose from our data tab here, and I'll select to make changes to a thing in our database. The thing I'd like to change is the current user, so the person who's logged in currently adding a new contact. And what I'd like to do is change the contacts field that they have stored in our database. So if you remember, that's a list of users. And what I'll need to do is choose to add something to that list. And that something will be the value of our search box. So if you remember, our search box was storing the value of a user. So we'll just be adding whatever user is stored within the search box at the time based on their phone number to the list of the total users' contacts. What I'll also need to do though back in my workflow editor is make changes to the person who currently is being indexed within the search box, because I'd like to also add the current user to their list of contacts. So I'm going to add an additional step within my workflow here. I'll once again be choosing from the Data tab and the Make Changes to a Thing option. And the thing I'd like to change is the person who is currently being featured within our search box. So its value, which of course is a user. And I'd like to change their list of contacts now, only this time I'll be adding to it the current user. So the person who's logged in making this contact. And now after both of these users have been added to each other's contact lists, we'll need to display the previous pop-up that we had created, which will allow a user to finally create a chat. So in my workflow editor, I'm going to select to add another step in our workflow here. And in this case, what I'd like to do is hide this pop-up that we're currently viewing, so the new contact pop-up, and then display the previous pop-up where we were creating a new chat. So I'm going to first select from our element actions option. And what I'd like to do is choose the hide option. And I'd like to hide the new contact pop-up, which is the pop-up we're currently working on. And once that pop-up is hidden, I can choose to show the previous pop-up. So from our element actions option here, I'll choose the show option. And in this case, I'll be showing the create chat pop-up, which was the pop-up we had previously referenced. So if I jump back into my design tab now, I can close this pop-up. While we're also in the process of showing and hiding pop-ups, I can create a workflow when our pencil icon is clicked here that displays our first create chat pop-up, because at the moment there's nothing referencing that this should be displayed. So I'm going to select our pencil icon here, I'll start edit a workflow, and I'll recognize that when this icon is clicked, I would like to show an element, and that element will be our create chat pop-up. And then back in my design tab again, I'm going to need to open up our create chat pop-up here, because I'll also need to create a workflow when this title here is clicked. And within that workflow, I'll be hiding our current pop-up here, and then I'll be displaying the create contact pop-up. So I'll open up the chat pop-up, I'll select the title here, I'll choose to start edit a workflow, and what I'd like to do first of all is hide the current pop-up. So under our element actions option, I'll choose to hide an element. The element will be the create chat pop-up, which is currently what we're viewing. And then from here, I'll need to show another element, and that will be our new contact pop-up. So I know the process of showing and hiding those pop-ups can seem a little tedious, but it's essential in order to just create a smooth and seamless user experience for our users in the case that they are not only creating a new chat, but also adding a new contact to their account. Now, what I'd like to focus on next, if I open up my design tab, is building out the process where we can actually create a new chat whenever the name of a contact is clicked within our chat creation pop-up. So I'm going to select on the name of the contact that'll be displayed within our repeating group here. And what I'd like to do is start edit a workflow. And within this workflow, it's a pretty straightforward process to create a new chat. What I'll need to do is head to our Data tab. And this will be the first instance where we use the Create a New Thing option, because at this point in time, this chat doesn't yet exist in our database. And so the type of thing I'd like to create is a chat. And within this chat, I'm just going to need to register both of the users who will be adding to it. So I'll be selecting that the chat users, which if you remember in our database was a list of users, will need to add to it, first of all, the current user, so the person who is creating this chat. And then I'll also need to add the contact of the person who they're selecting, which will be the second user within this chat. So I'll select that the chat users once again, I'll be adding to that list. We'll now need to also include the current sales user of our repeating group. And now once a chat has been created, what I'll need to do is create a navigation event that sends this user through to a dedicated page where we can host the messages within that chat. So I'll select to add another step within our workflow here. I'll be choosing from the navigation option. I will use the go to page option, and the destination page at this point doesn't yet exist, so I can choose to create a new page. I'll be calling this page the chat page because this is where we'll be hosting the messages within a chat. And now before we select the chat page as our destination page, there's one change I would like to make to that. So if we jumped over to our page drop-down menu here, we can open up that new chat page we had just created. And now at this point, there should be nothing on this page right now. It should be blank. The only change I'd like to make is updating the type of content that we'll be displaying on this page. So because I'm going to be displaying messages within a chat, I would like to recognize that we will need to store a chat on this page at any given time, which means that back in our workflow when we had created a new chat on our home page here, I'll just open up my workflow editor. And if I open up the workflow we were just in, I can select that the destination page will be our chat page. And now you'll see the bubble will require me to send through some data of a chat to that page. And that data, of course, will be the result of step 1 in our workflow, which was the new chat that we've just created. And after we've created a chat, I can open up my design tab again. And I'd just like to reference at this point that on our pop-up where we are creating a new chat, we have a list of all of the users who are contacts of the person who's currently logged in. And of course, when a user decides to create a chat with this contact, they'll click on their name and it'll create that within our database. But what we'll be doing in a later module is also display a list of all of those active chats on our homepage here within a repeating group, which means that once a chat has been created with a contact, I would like to remove that contact from this list, as they will now be featured on our main homepage under a separate list of all of the active chats. And now this is one of those small details which is quite crucial within your build just to create the same experience to the WhatsApp application. So I just wanted to make sure I take the time to run through this in good detail. And in order to create this experience, we'll need to open up our Create Chat pop-up, select into the repeating group here, and update the data source that we're displaying. So if you remember at this point in time, this repeating group is just displaying a list of all of the current users' contacts. And what I'll need to do is actually remove any of these contacts from this list that already have an existing chat with the current user. So once a chat has been created, I'd no longer like that user to be displayed within this list of potential users that a user could create a chat with. And the way I'll be doing this is just by selecting from the More option on our data source. So after we've searched for all of the current users' contacts, I would like to remove from it the users who currently have a chat with the current user. So I'll be typing in the word minus, and I'd like to select the minus list option, because in this case, I'll be removing a list of users from our existing list of contacts. And the contacts I would like to remove from this list are those who already have a chat with the current user. So in order to recognize that, I'm going to do a search through our database and search for all of the chats where the chat users contains the current user. And then I would like to select to remove from it all of the users within those chats. So that just essentially means that if anyone has an active chat with the current person who's logged in, they're no longer going to be displayed within this repeating group. And now by this point in our module, that pretty much summarizes the experience of creating a new chat, as well as being able to add a new contact within a user's profile. But there's one last minor feature I'd like to add to the current pop-up that we're viewing here, and that is a search functionality that allows a user to search for a particular contact and then create a chat with them or view their existing chat. And the reason I want to do this is because let's say a user has a few hundred different contacts. It might just be hard to manually scroll through and find the right contact to create a chat with. So as an alternative, we can just use another search box and create a feature that allows them to search through a list of all of their contacts. And I'll be adding this search feature right below our first initial heading there. So I'm going to select all of our elements on our page and just move these down a tad. And then I'll be scrolling down into our input forms, and I'll be once again adding in a search box onto our pop-up. And I'll be calling this search box contact. And similar to before, I'm going to leave the choice of style of this search box to be the dynamic choices, because I'll be searching through a list of all the users within our database. I will just need to define which particular users I'll need to search for. So I'll select the type of thing to search for as users. And then I'll be adding a constraint onto this search to only search and display those users who are a current contact of the current user. So I'll be adding a constraint, and I'll only display those users who within their list of contacts contains the current user, so the person who's logged in. And this just means that those two users are already acquainted across our platform, which means, of course, they can then create a new chat. So I'll close that search. And in this instance, I'd like the field that we're searching to be the name, because by this point, we no longer need to search for their phone number, as we've already added these users through that field. But I'm just going to quickly move this search field down. And from here, I'd like to create a workflow that recognizes when a user has been searched within this search box. And then I'd like to either create a new chat with this user if a chat doesn't already exist between the two users in our application. And if the instance that chat already does exist, I'd like to just send the user through to that chat page without having to create a duplicate chat in our database. And so the way we can create this workflow is by jumping over into our workflow editor. We can select to add in a new workflow. And for the trigger, we're going to select from our element actions here, and we'll identify when an input's value is changed. And the input, of course, will be our search box contact, which is just the new search box we've added. And the first workflow I'd like to build is the ability to create a new chat if one doesn't yet exist. So I'm going to select from our data tab, and similar to before, I'll create a new thing. The thing I'll be creating is a chat. And I'll need to add to this chat the list of both users. So I'll select that the chat users, I'll add to it the current user, so the person who's logged in searching for their friend or contact. And then I'll also add another user, so the chat users, I'll be adding to that list. And in this case, it will be the value of this search box. So the user who is currently being searched and displayed. Then once this chat has been created, I'm going to send this user through to that chat page. So I'll select the go to page option. The destination page will be our chat page, and the data I'll be sending through to it is the result of step 1, which is of course where we've just created a new chat. But as I had mentioned before, we're going to need to create a condition onto this workflow that only allows this to run when a chat between these two users doesn't yet exist, because I'd hate to create a duplicate of the same chat that is already happening in our application. So I'm going to select the workflow trigger here, and I'm going to add a condition, and I'll only allow this condition to run when a chat between these two users doesn't yet exist. So I'll be searching through our database for all of the chats where the chat users contains the current user, and when the chat users also contains the person who's being displayed within the search box. And if the first item in our database, so by the first item, what I mean is that because we're searching for all the chats with these two users, there's only going to be one instance of that within our database. So I can recognize that by selecting the first item. And if in our database we perform this search and the value is empty, I would like this workflow to continue running, which would create a chat and then send the user through to that chat page. And now what I can also do while I'm here is just update the event color to be green. So that way I know that in this case we are actually creating a new chat. Because what I'll also need to do now is create another version of this workflow that recognizes when this chat already does exist. So when this particular chat here will be not empty, meaning this chat will exist, I'd like to delete this step in our workflow where we're creating a new chat, and instead I'd like to just send the user through to that chat page. So I'm going to select to copy this workflow here. I'll paste this in. And because the chat already exists at this point, I'm just going to update the event color to be red. And as I mentioned before, we're going to still be searching for the chat between these two users in our database. Only this time we'll recognize when that value is not empty, meaning there is a chat between these two users in our database. So what I'd like to do is just remove the step in our workflow where we're creating a new chat, and instead I'll be sending the users through to this chat page, which means that I'll just need to update the data of the particular chat we'll be sending through to our chat page. So I'm just going to remove the value that was currently sitting there. And similar to the condition on our workflow, I'm going to need to search through our database for all of the chats where the chat users contains the current user. And then when the chat, its chat users, also contains the search box's value, I'm going to send through the value of the first item in our database where this chat exists between these two users, which of course there will only be one item in our database where this chat does exist between these two users. And that is the very last workflow we'll need to create within this step of our tutorial right now. What we can do is jump on over into our development environment and start to preview what this whole experience looks like. Over in my development environment here, I'm currently logged in as the user I created before, so Lachlan Kirkwood. If I was to select our pencil icon here to create a new chat, I'd see that our first pop-up would display, and because there's currently no contacts saved in my account, I don't have a list of users to contact yet. So what I'll need to do is select to add a new contact. You'll see that first pop-up will hide, our second pop-up will display, and I've just taken the time before to register another account within our application. So I'm just going to type in the phone number of that account. You'll see it'll register this phone number and associate it with a user. I can select on this user here and I'll choose to save that person as a contact. And now you'll see that this user has been added to my contact list. And from here I can select on the user's name, and that of course will create a new chat. So that workflow will run and it will now redirect us through to our chat page. And what you'll notice in the URL string here is that it's sent through the dynamic value of this specific chat that's just been created. But what I also want to show you is that if I jump back onto our homepage now, and if I was to create another chat, you'll see that that contact no longer exists within our repeating group, because by this point a chat has been created with them. So within the next module in this tutorial, what I'd like to do is just explain how we can now display a list of all of the existing chats on our homepage here. Back in my Notion doc, I'm just going to check off that I've finished creating the feature to create a new chat within our WhatsApp application. This of course was quite an extensive module within the series, just because it covered so much of the critical framework we'll need to rely on once we actually display chats in our application. So I'm going to just check off all of the individual features here that I ran you throughout the process. After taking the time to build out the feature where we can create a new chat within our WhatsApp clone today, the next feature I'd like to touch base on is just building out a way to display a list of all of the existing chats on a user's homepage. So these will be a list of all the chats that the current user is a member of. And this is actually a fairly straightforward process to build out. So let's just jump over into our homepage and I can show you how we can get started. On my homepage here, the first thing I'll be doing is just adding a repeating group element onto our page. So similar to the process where we were displaying a list of contacts on the pop-up before, I'm going to be displaying a list of users within a repeating group, only this time I'll be displaying a list of users within a chat. So for our repeating group on this homepage, I'll be displaying a list of all the chats, which means I'll need to update the type of content to also be a chat. And then I'll need to search for all of the chats within our database. So I'll choose the do a search for option. I'll select to search through all of the chats. And I'd just like to display only those chats where the chat users contains the current user, meaning that at least one of the members in any chat needs to be the current user who's logged in viewing their homepage. I'll then update the layout style of this repeating group to be extended vertical scrolling and select that the number of rows should be 3. And now the elements I'd like to add within our repeating group is actually information about the second person in our chat who isn't the current user. So this will essentially be the details of the person who's the receiver of the current user's messages. And so before I do that, I'm just going to move my repeating group across the page, just expand it out a tad. And I'd first like to add in the profile photo of the person that this user is messaging. So I'm going to select to add in an image element into our repeating group here. And when I'm adding a dynamic data source for this image, I'm going to need to display the current cell's chat, the chat users. And now one thing I'd just like to point out is that our chat users is a list of users. So we're currently displaying both the person who's receiving these messages as well as the current user who's logged in sending those messages. And what I'd like to do, of course, is only display the image of the person who isn't the current user. So that way, no matter who's logged in, they're not going to see their profile photo, but instead they'll see the profile photo of the person that they're messaging. So what I'll need to do is subtract the current user from this list of users. So I'll type in the word minus, and I'll be selecting to minus an item. And the item I'd like to minus is the current user. And that, of course, will just leave us with one user left, which is the user who isn't the current user. And I'd like to display their profile photo. From here, I can also just update the styling. So this is 45 by 45. I'm happy with that. I'll just update the roundness to be 100. So this image is a perfect circle. And then I can move that up into the top left-hand corner of our repeating group. Then beside this profile photo, what I'd like to do is display the name of the person that this current user is messaging. So I'm going to add in a text element. I'll once again insert dynamic data, and the data source will be much the same as the profile photo there. I'm going to select to display the current cell's chat, the list of chat users. Of course, I'll just be selecting to minus an item, and the item I'll be minusing is the current user. And then I'd like to display the only person who's left in that list, their name. I can also, if I'd like, open up our rich text editor and select to bold that text. And while I'm here, I am just going to actually update the size of this image here. I'll make it 55 by 55, just so it's a tad bigger. And then I'll just make sure the text isn't overlapping with the photo. And I'll move that up so it's in line with the top of our profile photo here. And now after I've added in this heading, below this I'm going to add another text element, which will just be a short preview of the last message sent within this chat. So I'm going to grab another text element here. I'll drag this out into my repeating group. And then within this, what I'd like to do is perform a search through our database for all of the messages where the chat that message belongs to equals the same value as the current cell's chat. So the chat within the current repeating group. And I'd like to display the last item within that. So the very last message sent within that chat, its message content, which of course is the actual text of the message itself. And then what I'd like to do is just search for the word truncate, because I'd like to truncate this text to 100 characters, meaning that it will just cut that message off at 100 characters. So that way, if the message is quite long, it's not going to take up too much space on our homepage here. And then I'm just going to make sure that this text is in line with our existing heading there of the user's name. And then finally, there's one last dynamic field I'd like to add into this repeating group cell, and that is just the date of the last message that was sent within this chat. So I'm just going to copy this heading here. What I'm going to do is remove the truncated to option and also the message content. So I'm going to be searching for all of the messages that belong to this chat within our database. I'll then display the last message that was sent, and I would like to type in the word create because I'll then be displaying the creation date of that, and I would just like to format this as the shortened abbreviation of that date. I can then just reduce the size of this element because it's not going to be a large field. I might also just need to expand my repeating group out a tad, as well as my page there. And I can just move that across. And I'm happy with how that's going to be formatted there. And the last thing I'll need to do from here is just reduce the empty space at the bottom of our repeating group there, just so there's not so much blank space below each chat. And finally from here, I'll just need to create a workflow when this chat is selected, because I'd like to redirect a user through to the chat page and send through with them the data of this current sales chat. So I'll be selecting the user's name within our chat here. I'll choose to start edit a workflow, and within this what I'd like to do is choose from a navigation event, select the go to page option, and the destination page will need to be our chat page, and the data I'll be sending with it is the current sales chat. And that is all I'll need to create for our home page here. Let's jump on over into our bubble development environment and now preview what this experience looks like. So over on my homepage here, I'm logged in as my Lachlan Kirkwood user, and you can see that I have my previous chat that I had created before with my test user 2 here. Because we currently haven't exchanged any messages, there's no dynamic text here displaying the last previous message, as well as the date of that last message. I'll be sure to show a more detailed example of this experience once we do have some message content stored within this chat. But for now, I just wanted to show you how we can send the user through to the chat page, as well as the dynamic value of the chat between this user and myself, who is the current user logged in. So I'm going to select on the user's name here, that workflow will run, and it sent me through to the chat page, as well as the dynamic value of the chat that I had with this particular user. Back in Notion, I'm going to check off that I finished building out the home page, which allowed us to display a list of all the existing chats. And throughout this, I explained how you could display the details of the opposing user within the chat. So that was just essentially making sure we were displaying the correct profile photo and the name of the person who wasn't the current user. And then finally, I also explained how we could create that workflow to redirect users through to our dedicated chat page. And that is all I have time for in this tutorial today. If you were interested in checking out the rest of the course, I'd recommend clicking the link in the description to purchase the full course. Within the complete course, I'll be walking you through the step-by-step instructions to complete the rest of our build. You can also get access to a suite of Bubble tutorials where you'll learn how to build other popular products. If you'd like to get started building some other popular products for free, I'll be sure to include some suggested links at the end of this video. Thanks again for taking the time to watch, and be sure to hit that subscribe button if you'd like to see any other useful tutorials to help you on your Bubble journey.